The Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were away from the Previous Rebbe from the time they got married, which is 1928, until they came to New York, which is halfway through 1941. That's a lot of years, right? It's 13 years or more, right? It's all of 29 and all of 30, and the decade is 12. It's about 13 and a half years that the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were separate from the Previous Rebbe. And there's a lot of correspondence. There's a lot of letters, back and forth. Every one of us would love to see our letters, our Rebbe's letters to the Previous Rebbe, and the Rebbetzins' letters to his father. For some reason, those letters we do not have. But the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin kept every scrap of paper they got from the Previous Rebbe. It was the most precious thing to them. They were chassidim. They were not just children, they were chassidim. The Rebbe and the Rebbetzin carried with them the entire correspondence between them and the Previous Rebbe. Now, a long time ago, 40 years ago, the Rebbe commissioned Bet 11, his librarian, to publish the Previous Rebbe's English Kaddish, which he did. He also gave, the Rebbe came from his house. When they started printing the Previous Rebbe's letters, the Rebbe came from his house with a folder of 2,000 letters that he had personally collected. 2,000 letters of Previous Rebbe. In that collection of 2,000 letters, there's a handful of letters of Previous Rebbe to him. But they're all what you call mechtavim teichnim. They're letters about Chassidus, about the history of Chassidus, and things of this sort. What we didn't know was that there were about 300 letters or 400 letters that are personal and private correspondence between the Previous Rebbe and the Rebbetzin that the Rebbe never gave. He felt they were personal. Well, after Gimel Tammuz, that collection of letters was found. And after those two Chachamim wrote their book, Lubavitch felt, the people who make these decisions felt that it's very important that they have to prove how flawed that entire attitude is. That the way they try to build it, the Rebbe became a Rebbe because he failed as an engineer, which is so stupid and so silly and so childish. It's trying so hard to make the Rebbe look bad. You make us look like an idiot. But in the secular world, oh wow, so well researched. As long as you have a lot of footnotes and a lot of books and quotes, it's Baba Mises. So Lubavitch reacted, and they did many things. They commissioned Joseph Telushkin to write the book, the Rebbe, and it corresponded. In one summer we got 3 books. Telushkin's book, Chaim Miller's book, and Adin Even Yisrael's book. They're brilliant, they're wonderful books. People will say that for a Hasidic boy or a girl to read those books may take away some of your Hasidus because they make the Rebbe look like a human being. But they're full of very, very important, good, factual information, letters, stories. He was able to college for many, many years. For many, many years. He officially was an engineer. He never went to college to be Mavada in college. And by the way, his professors all complained that he does brilliant work, his great grades. He just never came to school. They could have failed him. He came less than 50% of the time. You imagine? He was a terrible student. He just knew everything. I just saw, there's a guy in the 5 towns, he loves the Rebbe. And he has a lot of interesting stories. And one of the stories he learned in YU in the 70s by Rabbi Yasher Soloveitchik. And he heard this personally from him, that they were studying in Berlin. When the Rebbe was in Berlin, Soloveitchik was there also. And there was a professor who loved Yasher Berg. Yasher Berg was brilliant. He was a genius. He was a great student. And he hated Schneerson. Because Schneerson always sat in the back of the room because of Yichud. Men and women mixed, and he came either with a Gemara or with a Tanya. He never paid attention. Never listened to the professor, and the professor was so angry at him that at one point he asked the professor, Schneerson, "Do you hear what I said?" He said, "Yeah." So he said, "So repeat what I said," and they gave him back his lecture, word for word. There was once an exam, which is supposed to take 6 or 8 hours exams. The Rebbe completed it in a half an hour. In small little words, as I. And the Rebbe handed it in. The professor was so angry. He had a whole grudge against the Rebbe because the Rebbe never listened to him. He took the Rebbe's patent, threw it in the garbage. The Rebbe didn't say boo. Soloveitchik went over to the professor and said, "I think you should take that out of the garbage. I think you should take it out of the garbage. I know you don't like him, but he's very bright." And the professor liked Rabbi Soloveitchik because he was a very good student. So he took it out of the garbage, he starts reading it, and the guy turns pale. He said, "How do you do such work?" And how do you do it in half an hour? In other words, the brain of the Rebbe, in other words, as smart as the professor was, he had no idea how a person could be, it was just impossible. So the Rebbe went to university to become an engineer. Believe me, he had no interest in being an engineer. He had interest in making sure that we should stay from a Yidden, and whatever it took. But we're not having the college conversation now. We have it a couple times a year. We go into that rant and rave, as I'm sure you were aware. We did it already. We're going to do it on Thursday. We started it last week. But anyway, so they published this volume of Ignis. It's about 200 letters. It's not all of them, because the letters get very boring. The letters get very boring because the Rebbe was involved in the work of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe was away from the Frierdiker Rebbe for about 13 years. The Frierdiker Rebbe lived in Latvia, in Riga, Latvia, between 1928 and 1933. And then he lived in Poland, first in Warsaw, and then in the suburb of Warsaw called Otwocz, between 1933 and 1939, when the war started. Then the Frierdiker Rebbe left, and he traveled through Germany back to Riga, Latvia, and then he went from Latvia, which was a neutral country at that time. The Germans had not attacked Latvia. He went to Sweden, and he left from Sweden, I think, to New York. The Frierdiker Rebbe did. The Rebbe was in Paris at the time. The Rebbe was under the Nazis occupied Paris. The Rebbe had to run away to the south of France and so on. All that time there were letters back and forth. There were a few things that the Rebbe did for the Frierdiker Rebbe on an ongoing basis, which this book reveals. Number one, the Frierdiker Rebbe was a compulsive Sfarim buyer. An obsessive Sfarim buyer. The Frierdiker Rebbe would spend hundreds of dollars, thousands for a single volume if it was worth it. And the Rebbe was desperately looking for Sfarim. The Frierdiker Rebbe had a compulsion for Sfarim. This is, of course, the famous library of the Frierdiker Rebbe that was contended in Tafshin Memhei by Barry, whether it's private or public. And the Rebbe, of course, argued that the Frierdiker Rebbe didn't collect it for himself, he collected for the Kahal Nash and so on and so forth. In the European years, the Frierdiker Rebbe was a compulsive buyer of Sfarim. The Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe would say, would spend money that he needed for his own health, for his medicines, to buy a sefer. If a sefer came to his hand and it was a rare book, and he wouldn't be able to get it tomorrow, he would literally give away money they need to buy medication, to buy Sfarim. And he was always shopping. I mean, the background of this is, I don't know if you guys know the story. His father, the Rebbe Rashab, had a huge library that had been collected from the previous Rebbeim, the Rebbe Rashab and the Rebbe Manash, some of it from the Tzemach Tzedek. Some of those Sfarim go back as far as the Alter Rebbe. That's the library which is now sitting in Moscow that Lubavitch is contending. The library that we lost. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, so the Frierdiker Rebbe in the 1920s in Russia had no Sfarim. His father had tens of thousands of Sfarim. The Sfarim were stuck in an archive, someplace in a storehouse. Eventually the government realized what those Sfarim were, and they put them into a library in Moscow. Putin moved them to the Jewish library, which is right next door. If you've been to Moscow, the Maran Rosh Shul is a big palace. Right next door to the Maran Rosh Shul, there's a Jewish library. Putin paid for that out of his own pocket. It's a beautiful library. A beautiful museum, pardon me. In that museum, he put all the Sfarim that belong to us. And it's a very, very sensitive issue that we will not discuss.
But it's owned by Jews now?
I can't hear you.
Is it owned by
It belongs to the government. It's a museum. It's public or private? What's a museum? Right? So Jewish people are managing it, but the Russian, Putin paid for the museum out of his own private pocket. He paid for the Jewish museum the whole cost. I mean, he's a very, very rich man. Anyway, so the Frierdiker Rebbe don't Sfarim. So he bought a new library. And if I, as a boy, read the Ignis, there was a Jew whose name, I think his name was Rosen, but I think I forgot his name. There was a Jew, a collector, who had a large library of Sfarim. It was the 1920s. It was after the Bolshevik Revolution. He was trying to get rid of his son, wanted to get some money. He sold the Frierdiker Rebbe his entire library, lock, stock, and barrel. The Frierdiker Rebbe negotiated back and forth what he was selling and how much money he wanted. The Frierdiker Rebbe paid him a lot of money. Oysa Wiener, the Wiener collection it was called. The Frierdiker Rebbe took this library with him from Russia to Latvia and then later to Poland. That's the library. It disappeared when the war started, and those Sfarim were shipped to New York right after the war in 1946 and 47, and that's what we call the Frierdiker Rebbe's library, which today was joined now after the start of the Sfarim with the Rebbe's library. But the Frierdiker Rebbe was a rabid, was a compulsive collector of Sfarim. If there was a sefer of value, he'd pay whatever money to buy it. And it was a very competitive business. In other words, he wasn't the only one trying to buy Sfarim. So the Rebbe was charged with looking for Sfarim. The Rebbe used to go around to libraries and to private collectors and to auctions. And in this volume of Igris, you see how the Rebbe is writing to the Rebbe, literally catalogs. He'd collect catalogs that were selling Sfarim, and he would send the Frierdiker Rebbe and say, this book may be worthwhile, that book may be worthwhile. And the Rebbe and the Frierdiker Rebbe always talking about Sfarim. And often the Frierdiker would say, yeah, buy it. And then the Rebbe would buy it for the Rebbe. But I don't know how to say this gently, so I'll say it not gently. It's incredibly boring to read. No one's interested in how much it cost for, you have a letter that says, I went to this guy, he's selling this book for 100 rubles. The other guy's selling it for 90, but it's not as good quality. It's very boring. So they put a sample. In this volume of Igris, which I'm speaking to, they put samples. Better let them put enough of the letters to see what the Rebbe was doing. But if you would put all those letters, you'd fall asleep. It's just very, very, very boring. And it doesn't make a difference. Letter after letter after letter, where the Rebbe is literally going shopping to the Frierdiker Rebbe to see what kind of Sfarim he wants to buy, and the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying, well, let's look at this, and let's look at this, and maybe we should buy this, and then the Rebbe buys it and sends it to Poland, or to Latvia, where the Frierdiker Rebbe was living. So one of the repeated themes in this volume of letters is the Rebbe's involvement in buying Sfarim for the Frierdiker Rebbe. This is numero uno, and it goes through the entire book, period. Number two, the Frierdiker Rebbe's finances. But the Frierdiker Rebbe's money. The Frierdiker Rebbe was a Rebbe, and obviously he was a collector of tzedakah. And basically is a big bad word, but I'm going to use it. You can divide the Frierdiker Rebbe's collection into two groups. The money that people gave him for his personal use, what we call maimid, and money the Frierdiker Rebbe collected for the various tzedakahs that he was involved with, whether it was the Jews in Russia or it was the yeshivas in Poland. The Frierdiker Rebbe was busy. When the Rebbe moved from Latvia to Poland, Poland was a third world country, and Poland was deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. The Frierdiker Rebbe was in a position where he was not able to keep his money in Poland. The Polish government would have gone after him with fangs. I don't understand why, but that's the what. The Frierdiker Rebbe could not keep his money in Polish banks. He couldn't do it. And he couldn't put it under his mattress either. So the Rebbe became the Frierdiker Rebbe's banker. Literally. The Rebbe was living in Paris. The Frierdiker was living in Poland. And in 1933, that means it took about 6 or 7 years, the Frierdiker Rebbe, all the money that Rebbe raised, and you guys understand this, most of the money that Rebbe raised came from where, Kindalach? From America. No one had any money. Everyone was broke. The Russian Jews were broke. They went through Stalin, Yamach Shmei. The Polish Yidden were broke. They went through World War I. Okay, there was a couple of dollars maybe in Western Europe. How many Yidden in France were sending the Frierdiker Rebbe checks? It was American money. It was a lot of money. $100 in those days is worth how much today? $5,000? A lot. And American Jews were very rich. And American Jews were incredibly generous. Yidden in America gave a lot of stuff. I once heard from the Rebbe myself. It's one of those quotes that I'll never forget. It's hard for you guys to relate to this, but if you grew up around the Rebbe, you have the events the moments you'll never forget. One of the moments I will never forget as a bacher was the Rebbe once in the middle of a sikha stopped. And he said, quote, this was a verbatim quote, word for word, that Eibish that geschickt Yidden in America. Sie sollen poshet machen asach Geld. End of the quote. If you know Yiddish, you hear it in the original. Hashem sent Jews to America, they should simply make a lot of money. Period. American Jews built the state of Israel. Anti-Zionist, pro-Zionist, say what you want. American money made that Yisrael. American money paid the bills, and they still pay the bills. American Jews. American Jews saved my life. Any one of you who came from any place in the world after the war, if anybody here, if your ancestors lived in Europe till World War II, and your ancestors ended up in DP camps, and then you moved to Australia, or to South America, or to Israel, or to America, American Jews paid your way for years. For years. From the time the war was over in 1945 until you relocated to whatever country you did years later. American Yidden give on a shit stuck. It's really true. And a lot of American Jews had very sentimental feelings for Lubavitch. Some of them came from Chassidim. And the Rebbe raised money. The people in America raised money. The money was not sent to Poland. It was sent to Paris. And people didn't like that. You know why? Because when you give a Rebbe money, you want something back. But if the Rebbe doesn't see the check because his son-in-law is handling it, so the way it was dealt was, people sent the money to France, and the Rebbe would immediately inform the Frierdiker Rebbe, so-and-so gave so much, because people had supplications. You know, the people sent the Frierdiker Rebbe money, but they wanted brachas, they wanted hatzlachas, and so on. The Rebbe was Frierdiker Rebbe's banker. Pochke Pshutai. And in this book, there's quite a few letters about finance, where the Rebbe says to him, we have a friend in Paris, whose name is Sender Reinin. He has a safe deposit box. Borrow the safe deposit box, put the cash in the safe deposit box, and then the Frierdiker Rebbe says, apply for an account, apply for safe deposit. And the Rebbe managed the Frierdiker Rebbe's finances for all those years. He was very involved. And every dollar that came and went from America to Poland had to pass through Paris. And the Rebbe was very busy with that. It was labor intensive, it seems. And by the way, a lot of that work, I don't think there's even a question, was done by the Rebbetzin. The Rebbe was kind of busy, but the Rebbe was Frierdiker Rebbe's banker. And in this volume of letters, in addition to this preoccupation with Sfarim, there is a lot of financial detail. And again, when Ben Levin saw the archive of letters, I think it's 400 letters between the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbetzin, he printed about half of them. And he writes why. He says it's boring. I mean, how many times can you read about money? It's just boring. I mean, the names of the people who gave the money, they probably had to cut out anyway because it's private. And the amounts are like, who cares? You know, so they printed a sample. When you go through the volume, you see, it's very clear that the Frierdiker Rebbe leaned on the Rebbe very heavily. He trusted him implicitly. The trust was unbelievable. The Frierdiker Rebbe never had to worry that the Rebbe was going to pocket some of the money, you understand? And the Rebbe handled the Rebbe's finances. This is number 2. And it's a recurring theme in the entire Sefer. And then there's number 3. And number 3, in a certain way, is really the most poignant. The Frierdiker Rebbe began to show signs of paralysis in 1933. The Frierdiker Rebbe was beat to pulp, by the KGB, by the Russische. When he was in prison 18 and a half days, they beat him with a stick many times. They brutalized his body. And it wasn't like the Frierdiker Rebbe was particularly nice to his body until that point. When the Frierdiker Rebbe came out of Spaleka prison, his body was broken. It was hard for him to walk. But you could see the films when the Frierdiker comes to America. He looks like a king. You ever see the Frierdiker Rebbe the first trip to America? He walks off that gangplank. He looks like a king. He looks so regal. He looks cool. Now his body was pretty badgered at that time, but he held it together. A few years after that, he started to have tremors. Then it hurt him to walk, and then of course hurt him to talk. That illness progressed for 17 years, from 1933 till he passed away in 1950. The Rebbe said once in a sikha, more than once in a sikha, that the doctors said there's no medical explanation for how he lived for the last 17 years of his life. Just think about that. The doctors said that there's no explanation how the Frierdiker Rebbe lived the last 7 years of his life. He became very, very, very sick. The problem was, A, there was no diagnosis, and B, there was no cure. And the Rebbe kept getting sicker. The Frierdiker, they gave him medicines. The Frierdiker was getting sicker. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, who was by then already living in Paris, I think, by the time the Frierdiker Rebbe showed paralysis, I think he was living in Paris. He may still be living in Berlin, but maybe just for a short time. Started going with the Frierdiker Rebbe to the doctor. Why? I mean, the Rebbe was a pretty smart guy, right? Pretty smart guy. He went to college to study engineering. The Rebbe understood medicine. And he started to cross-examine the doctors. Wherever the Frierdiker Rebbe went, the Frierdiker Rebbe would not see a doctor without the Rebbe, and they're living in different countries. I mean, it's Europe. I mean, Europe is like walking from Connacht to Borough Park, but it is different countries. And it's the 1930s, it's not 2023 when you have this EU idea. But the Rebbe did not see a doctor without the Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe traveled to see doctors in Paris. He traveled to see doctors in various places in Europe, in Vienna. The Rebbe would stop what he was doing, and he would either travel with the Frierdiker Rebbe or they would meet, and the Rebbe would be involved in the Rebbe's medical care, the Frierdiker Rebbe's medical care. And by the way, in the book Early Years, which is in English, you have a very good window The book Early Years ends by the Rebbe's wedding, but you still have an interesting window into the involvement of the Rebbe in the Frierdiker Rebbe's medical care. I've heard from people, I think this is true actually, that the Rebbe would not allow the Frierdiker Rebbe to take a medication until he tried it himself first.
Wow.
He wanted to see the side effects. The Rebbe took a medicine he didn't need. He wanted to see the side effects because he wanted to know how it would affect the Frierdiker Rebbe, and on that basis they would determine which medication he would take. I mean, the Rebbe was pretty crazy. About his father-in-law, absolutely crazy. And the Rebbe wouldn't see a doctor without the Rebbe. And in this book, again, you have a sampling of this. What happens is, what I understand it is, the Frierdiker Rebbe begins to get sick, and they bring him to a bunch of doctors, and he gets sicker and sicker and sicker, and they don't know what to do. They just don't know what to do. Probably till 35, in other words, for about 2 years. And there was a doctor in Paris who was a Jewish guy. He wasn't from, he had a sanitarium. A sanitarium is a word for, no one uses that word anymore. A private hospital, I basically would call it. And he had a new approach to dealing with medicine, which had to do with diet and exercise. In other words, what you would call today holistic healing. And the Rebbe went to see him. The Frierdiker went to see him. And he provided the Frierdiker with a diet and with a regime of how to live. And the Frierdiker Rebbe began to use that diet based on our Rebbe's recommendation, and he began to heal. In other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe's deterioration stops at a certain point. And this doctor, B'derech HaTeva, did a lot to save the Frierdiker Rebbe's life. The Rebbe was living in Paris, so the Frierdiker would come to Paris to see this doctor, and he would spend some time, and the Rebbe was there to help him and to look after him and to do whatever he needed to do for him and so on. But the Mamish Lo Yimash Yadav, when it came to the Rebbe's medical care, the Frierdiker's medical care, the Frierdiker Rebbe wouldn't budge without the Rebbe. The Rebbe had to take him to the doctor, had to consult with the doctor, had to explain to the Frierdiker Rebbe what the doctors were saying, and help the Frierdiker Rebbe decide on the future direction. And you see in the Igros Kodesh how the Rebbe writes.
Is this after the Frierdiker Rebbe went to jail?
Yeah, he said he came out of Russia. The jail was in Russia. This is the 30s. Frierdiker Rebbe was in jail in 1927. His illness begins in 1933, 6 years after. And in the year 1933, we were afraid that we would lose him. That's how bad it got. But then it turned around slowly, okay? And the Rebbe, our Rebbe, was constantly with the Frierdiker Rebbe when it came to his medical care. And then, of course, in America, once they came here, clearly the Rebbe was very, very involved in the Frierdiker Rebbe's medical care. And in this book, you get a sampling of this also. I'll just give you one example. And I don't have this in my stack, but I remember the book. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes to his daughter, to the Rebbetzin, your husband, my son-in-law, Harav, and then the Rebbe's name, is not looking after me like a dedicated son-in-law, but like a loving, gentle daughter. The Rebbe writes to the Rebbetzin, he takes care of me the way you would. In other words, he's not just my son-in-law, he just takes care of me, just takes care, looks after me. And the Frierdiker Rebbe writes it to the Rebbetzin. In this volume of Igros, you have moments of love and intimacy between the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin, Frierdiker Rebbe and his daughter, that should not be in print. They're just so special. This is one example, but there's some very, very beautiful illustrations of this. So that's number 3, right? So the first thing I told you was books. The second thing I told you was banking. The third thing I told you was medicine. And then number 4. Number 4 is the biggest issue of all. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, and God forgive him for saying these words, milk the Frierdiker Rebbe like I milk a cow. Every day he wanted something more from him. The Rebbe had no mercy on the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe was busy. The Frierdiker Rebbe was writing Chassidus. The Frierdiker Rebbe was busy. And the Rebbe says, I need more stories. I need more, what the Rebbe calls, Vasarum Chassidus is, what's around Chassidus. And the Rebbe manipulated the Frierdiker Rebbe to doing a lot of things. The Frierdiker Rebbe wrote many, many letters explaining the history of Chassidus, the stories of Chassidus. Most of those letters were written by the Rebbe's behest. The Rebbe he dialed the Frierdiker Rebbe's number. He knew how to push those buttons. And the Frierdiker Rebbe actually writes to the Rebbe in one letter, you're the only person who cares. You're the only one who cares. And the Rebbe began to work on the Frierdiker Rebbe, that the Frierdiker Rebbe should give out his treasure. One of the most important contributions the Frierdiker Rebbe made to Chassidus is the history, the stories. It's not just history and stories, but it's also the soul of Chassidus. There's actually a letter where the Rebbe writes to the Frierdiker Rebbe in Yiddish, Mir felt asach. Mir felt God asach. I am missing a lot. I am missing an awful lot. Spezial vasarum Hasidus is, especially what's around Hasidus. And the Frierdiker Rebbe Siches, the Rebbe milked him. When the Frierdiker Rebbe verbringt, he spoke short. He would say a word and stop, say a word and stop, say a word and stop. Then the Rebbe would say, okay, I want to print a Sicha. So I'll edit it. You know how the Frierdiker Rebbe edited a Sicha? He took the Sicha that he said, made an X across the whole page, turned over the page and began to rewrite it, but he wrote it in 12, 15 pages. That's still the Kutei Deburim. It's all the Rebbe's credit. It's all the Rebbe's credit. The Rebbe just wanted the Frierdiker Rebbe to give. And the Frierdiker Rebbe couldn't say no to his son-in-law. It was a very interesting relationship. The Frierdiker Rebbe loved the Rebbe as much as the Rebbe loved the Frierdiker Rebbe. And that's an awful lot of love. Trust me, it's an awful lot of love. And you see it in this volume. So this is really the preeminent. This book, it's really the story. It's the written story of the relationship between the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbetzin during the 13 years or so that they were separate. And the story comes to life. You read this book, read this volume of Igris, and like I said, some of it is so intimate, it's so personal. But you see first how much love there was from the Frierdiker Rebbe to the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin, and back and forth, vice versa, and the degree of involvement. So when some guy writes a book and he claims that the Rebbe wanted to become an engineer, and he became a Rebbe because he was a failed engineer, the whole supposition is so absolutely ridiculous. But when you look through this book, you see the Rebbe spent every minute of his day and night during those years, when he was away from the Frierdiker Rebbe, thinking about the Frierdiker Rebbe. He had no ambition. All the Rebbe wanted to do was serve the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he does. And you see it in this volume incredibly clearly. So this volume came out, by this point it's 13 years ago, 2009, 2010, something like that. So when that book came out, I obviously read it, and I started giving classes on it. I went through a period where, what I do, Chav Shvat, I took this book out, and I took some letters, and I read them. But a lot of years have passed. I haven't done it in a long time. And I decided this morning, at about 5:45 in the morning, I'm doing it again. I want to go back to this volume of Igris, and I want to read you excerpts, letters. The problem is, if I would have had 2 hours, I have this book of Igris Kodesh. Almost every other page is folded. In other words, I folded all the letters that I like, which is like most of them, you know. And I have this geschmack. I want to go through the entire volume and copy all those letters in order and prepare a syllabus where I can learn them all, because they're really very precious. And I'm just going to say one more thought. The most precious parts of this volume are the few occasions, there's not a lot, the few occasions where we have the letters from our Rebbe to the Frierdiker Rebbe. 95% of the book, 99% of the book, is the Frierdiker Rebbe's letters to his son-in-law and his daughter. In a few cases, the Rebbe's letters to the Frierdiker Rebbe are in there. And it would be worthwhile, just take that collection of letters and read it as a class to see not how the Frierdiker Rebbe is writing to the Rebbe, but how the Rebbe is writing to the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's so fascinating. I'll give you a number of examples. The Frierdiker Rebbe asks the Rebbe, what are you learning and how's life and what's going on? And the Rebbe doesn't want to answer him as a chassid. So he writes back, well, I'm learning Baba Basra, but I'm really not learning well, and it's not going so good. And believe me, the Rebbe was doing fine. It's a Pashat Behalten. He didn't want to show himself to the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's one of the simanim of a chassid. So he sort of beats around the bush. He doesn't answer the question straight. Another example is the Frierdiker Rebbe begs them to write him letters every day and tell him everything that's going on in his life, and they refuse to do it. Not only the Rebbe doesn't do it, the Rebbetzin doesn't do it. And the Rebbe nudges. I want you to write me long letters, tell me everything that's happening. I'm your father, I want what's going on. They didn't treat him like children, they treated him like chassidim. You don't write to a chassid, I went to the store and I bought cherries. So for a while, let's say a year or two, the Frierdiker Rebbe asks, and they don't deliver, so he stops asking. So there's a quote from the Frierdiker Rebbe that reads, the letters of many pages that I'm talking to you about, I didn't get them. I'm afraid they weren't even written yet. So at some point, the Rebbe answers. The Frierdiker Rebbe asks once and twice and 3 times and 4 times and 5 times. And the Rebbe said, Pasha can't do it. And in my opinion, this is just my opinion, the reason they can't do it is because how do you write to a Rebbe about parochial things. You can't do it. I went to the store and I came home, we bought nice dishes and we washed them and we tabled them, and I found a store that I could eat the meat from. The Rebbe wasn't going to do that to Frierdiker Rebbe, because he didn't see the Frierdiker Rebbe only as his father. He saw the Frierdiker Rebbe as his Rebbe. And the thing that I find more interesting is, it's very clear, although it's between the lines, at the Rebbetzin Chayamushka, she also didn't treat her father like a father. She treated her father like a Rebbe / father. So there was certain protocol. You didn't just sit around and schmooze with the Frierdiker Rebbe. Even if the Frierdiker Rebbe expressly asked you to do it, they couldn't do it. So finally the Rebbe responds with 3 paragraphs, and I should do this. I should go to the book, just find those pieces of the Rebbe's and make a class out of it, because it's just so special. The Rebbe writes as follows. There's different kind of personalities. There are people in this world, they walk into a room, they see everything and everybody. They walk into a country, see everything and everybody. And then there are people who are called Balei Ha'iyun. They have very clear focus. And they see only what they're involved with. And what's happening around them, they simply do not see. And the Rebbe writes, I'm not saying that it's necessarily a good thing, but this is the kind of guy I am. Rebbe, I only see what I'm doing. I don't see what's going on around me, and I don't think you want me to tell you how much money I spent on bread this morning. I don't think that's what you want me to write. I have nothing to say. My life is boring, basically. I have nothing to tell you. And at some point, the Frierdiker Rebbe just stops asking. He stops asking. By the way, one of the more sensitive little details in this letter is when they first get married, there are brachas for children, but for a very short time, maybe 2 or 3 years. And the Frierdiker Rebbe stops sending them brachas. The Rebbe's father never stops. The Rebbe's father was arrested in 1939. In every letter, there's brachas for children. The Rebbe's never had any children. The Frierdiker Rebbe also writes to his son and daughter and son-in-law, brachas for children, but by Tzaddik Gimel, Tzaddik Dal, by the mid-30s, he stops writing it. I suspect B'das Tachten, the Frierdiker Rebbe felt that it was more painful for them to receive the bracha than not to receive the bracha. But it stops pretty early. It's surprising how early on, in the first couple of years, every letter, there's a bracha for Zarachai V'Kayama, it stops pretty early on. By 1934, he stops, maybe even earlier, he stops writing to them the brachas for children, the Frierdiker Rebbe does. Now, one of the interesting features of the volume, which makes the book very interesting, is this. When the Rebbe writes to the Rebbetzin, when the Frierdiker Rebbe writes to his daughter, he writes in Yiddish. But it's like real Yiddish. It's Yiddish. No, it's literary Yiddish. It's impossible to read. You need translation. When he writes to the Rebbe, he writes in Hebrew. And when he writes to the two of them, he writes in Yiddish so the Rebbetzin could read it. I mean, the Rebbetzin never couldn't read Hebrew, but that was the way he wrote. To his daughter, he wrote in Yiddish, and to the Rebbe, wrote in Hebrew. So the way the letters go, it's back and forth Hebrew to Yiddish. So when Bet 11 published the volume, all the Yiddish is translated.
The Rebbetzin didn't speak.
Of course she did. The Rebbe wrote to his daughter in Yiddish. Here, look how the page looks. See, the page is split. Yeah? This page on the left is split, on the right it's not. On the right it's split, left it's not. Why? If he wrote in Yiddish, so Bet 11 put the translation opposite it. If he wrote in Hebrew, there's nothing to translate. So this book is full of this back and forth, Yiddish, Hebrew, Hebrew, Yiddish. And in other words, you know who the Rebbe is writing to, if he's writing to both of them, or he's writing just to the Rebbe, based on the language that he chooses. It's one of the little features of the Sefer, which just it makes it a little more interesting to see the nature of the correspondence that the Frierdiker Rebbe had with his children. When does this class end?
29.
So I got 4 minutes. So I'm going to read one letter. I'm sorry I'm out of time. I'm going to go across the hall to the seminary base and read some more letters. Okay, that's what I'm doing. This is our Chob Beis Shvat prep. Hope this doesn't disappoint you. This is the best way for me to prepare for Chob Shvat. You know why? Because when I talk about the Rebbetzin, I was recently commissioned by a group in Israel to do a video on the Rebbetzin. So I said to this woman, I never met her. I don't know the first thing about her. How can I talk about her? So she writes, we have a bunch of classes on your website about the Rebbetzin. It's true, I do. And you know what? I really shouldn't. I mean, I try not, obviously I don't make stuff up. I try to get it from other people. But this is the safest thing you can do. I mean, when I'm reading letters from the Frierdiker Rebbe to the Rebbetzin, I'm not making anything up. I'm just reading it. And it's fascinating. It's so interesting. And like I said to you a moment before, one of the most interesting components is the way the Rebbe writes to the Frierdiker Rebbe. You see the bittul. It's extraordinary. But anyway, here's a letter which is going to make your hair stand on your head, okay? Mein Tochter, the letter is dated Friday, Pashas Pinchas, 1923. The Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were not yet Chas and Kala. The Rebbetzin was 22 years old, the Rebbe was 21 years old. And they had been dating, they had met a few times. Quote, Mein Tochter, my daughter, die Woche habe ich energisch gelernt Hilchis Mendel Sheyichye. Who knows Hebrew? Who knows Yiddish? This week, I energetically studied the laws of Mendel Sheyichye. They spent some time. And they were checking each other out. They were sizing each other up. Kimat jeden Tag bis Nacht, almost every day until yesterday evening. Einige Scheisen Tag, a few hours each day. The Rebbe and the Rebbe hung out. And they talked. Now, a Rebbe doesn't hang, a Rebbe doesn't chill, There doesn't have the word chill in his vocabulary. Rebbes don't relax, But there was a socializing, there was a schmoozing, verbracht zusammen, they talked. Sonntag haben wir alle selbe dritt verbracht am ganzen Tag. Sunday, the three of us met the Friedrich Rebbe, the Rebbe, and the older son of the Rashak, he was with them. What happened was the family went on vacation, quote, vacation. And ironically, and in some kind of strange way, the women went home early, and the men stayed on the vacation. The women went back to Leningrad, the Rostov, and the men stayed on. And the reason, obviously, was the Friedrich Rebbe wanted to check the Rebbe out. He wanted time with the Rebbe, and they had about a week. A week. The son-in-law and father-in-law, the Rebbe was not yet officially chosen, spent a week sizing each other up. Is this a good idea, Sehr priyatne, very interesting. Is geblieben Shabbos da, he remained here for Shabbos. Menastam wird Sonntag mit Hashem fahren heim mit Glück, and probably Sunday he's going to go home in good fortune. Okay, remember, you're talking about our Rebbe now. Fühlt sich gar anders. He feels entirely different. Wie dem ersten Mal was es hier gewesen, and the first time he came to visit. Friedrich writes to the Rebbetzin, during his first visit, the Rebbe was apparently very uncomfortable. He's much more comfortable now. The Rebbe writing about it, he's much more comfortable. Es ist geblieben sehr a gute Priatner und Italiener von Kavkaz. There was a very good and pleasant mark left over from the Caucasus. The Caucasus is where they were on vacation. The Caucasus Mountains in the bottom of Europe. Wollte Welle noch einmal gehen auf der Berg spazieren. If it would be up to him, he'd climb the mountains again. The Rebbe apparently liked to climb, like nature. This is the Friedrich Rebbe writing to the Rebbe. Do we need this information? I don't know. Is it going to make us bigger chassidim or smaller chassidim? But this is what the Friedrich Rebbe writes, and they printed it. We got it. Yeah, thanks to those Fed. We have this volume would not have been published. They needed to publish it. That's how they felt, and they printed this letter. He likes to climb the mountains. Mehr dem Spazier Bisenberg, but it's not so much climbing the mountain itself. It's the walk from the hotel to the mountain. Ich kann sagen, Friedrich Rebbe, a pretty smart guy, yeah? After spending a week with the Rebbe, he writes to his daughter, I can say, as ich ken shem a bissel. You speak Yiddish? I know him a little bit. The Friedrich Rebbe understood that to unwrap the Rebbe wasn't a simple package. After a week, ist geblieben sehr zufrieden von der Priyam und Aufnahme. He was very happy from how he was greeted and how he was treated. Now, this is very disturbing. Listen to this. Hat azah Führung nicht gesehen. The Rebbe never saw such a conduct. Now, the Rebbe did not grow up in a barn. I don't know if you know it. The Rebbe grew up in a house with a very loving father and an incredibly adoring mother. The Rebbe's parents were beautiful Jews, and they were a good tata mama, you understand? And the Friedrich Rebbe says, our home, he never saw that. In other words, the Friedrich Rebbe is saying to the Rebbetzin, as great a home as the Leivik and Rebbetzin Chana had, the home that we run is for him a surprise, and he's enjoying it. And it says, Sehr a heimische und a freundliche, a very, very heimish. How do you say heimish in English? Huh? The English term for heimish is heimish. And friendly, was as Gid Zera Sach, that adds an awful lot. So the Rebbe is writing to his daughter. And he's saying to her, I spent a week with the Rebbe. A week. How much time does the average father spend to a son-in-law before they get engaged? 10 minutes in the dining room with a cup of tea and everyone's nervous. a week. And he says to the Rebbetzin, I think I know him a little bit. This is all setting up the shidduch. That would take 6 years. It took him 6 years to get married. Nobody knows the whole story. At least I don't know the whole story, but that's just a part of the story. Anyway, that's one letter. What time is it? Time to finish the class? Okay, we're done. Okay, I think it was a very interesting class. Yeah.